everyone, to episode 2 of the Untitled One Piece podcast. Remember again that we are the only podcast about the One Piece trading card game. And from last week, we have had no real movement on figuring out a name. Truth be told, I don't think we've even discussed it, so it's clearly not high priority in terms of what we want to do here and just our other focuses in life outside of the card game, but we'll land on one eventually. I guess just talking about it out loud here for a moment. Just picking a crew or something like that is such low-hanging fruit to me. It doesn't really interest me. I still don't have like a good sense of direction of like what a good name, what a better name would be. But at least that's, I think, one reason why we're not just the Straw Hat Pirates or whatnot, what have you. I mean, there's certainly some like obscure pirates that like no one would ever choose to reference, but we'll find our name eventually, I think.
Yeah, one of
Bring
those
back Sokka, the podcast.
one of those things where you just probably just let it happen naturally instead of trying to force one or come up with
Yeah,
one yourself.
absolutely. And so I think I last week, I think we had some good feedback on the first episode. I was just kind of caught in a lurch last week and ended up recording on my phone. So apologies for some audio mismatch there. So it should be technical issues, hopefully a little better this week. But yeah, let's just go ahead and get right to it. So our main focus of last week's episode was previewing for the Latin American, I guess what was nationals, since it semantically not quite a finals, Bandai Card Fest finals, since it was open rather than invite. But I think against some of what we said last week, I know I said something to the effect of I didn't know or I wasn't sure like what amount of like American top players had their sights on the event. Basically, all of them were there for the most part, and in terms of just kind of the biggest names in our game at the moment. We had Cross, Jonas, Clyde, Holden. I mean, off the cuff, are those just the biggest four? Like all like independently of their performances this weekend. Like if you had to name like four top players, pull names out of a hat or what have you. I mean, Chris Sock is would be a contender certainly. Cody.
Yeah, you had Cody. I mean, we had Eric Quintana, who is there, made his way into the top 8. Very strong player. Been on BY for basically since the deck came out. So that's one of the notable names. We also had Wraith or Awakened TCG, who got into top 64, which is another notable NA name. Notably, one of the only Blackbeards to make it into top 64. So overall, like you said, pretty notable names and high American. Shout out to the LATAM community, because to be able to defend your country in a top 8 that was not favored for you to do so is pretty impressive. I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah, and so I guess just kind of the biggest news coming out of the event, or just naturally the biggest result to discuss, is that we saw Shanks take down the entire tournament. Which I forget how much I put this into words last episode, but I was even willing to joke like last week, like that. I think I would have put Shanks, contender tier, fraud tier. I think we just had those two, and I was like, I didn't actually think Shanks, like, it's a very good deck. You're wrong, but I don't think I really would have ever predicted that it was going to take down the event. So we had Nestor, I think his name was.
Yep, Nestor Rivera.
Results. Ivan Rivera Espinoza winning with Shanks. We have Joao Pedro Miedros Zabrano. I believe he's a Pokemon player. I know there's, I think, 4 Brazilian players that made the top 64. One of them was Gustavo Wada. He's one of the best Pokemon players of all time. Certainly one of the best players out of Brazil and Latin America made top 64. And I think 2 other names that were with that group that I'm just not as immediately familiar with. Doflamingo in second. Matthew Desira on Eno, another more notable deck worth talking about. We'll get into that in a little bit. Holden Miller. Kind of an interesting story, I guess, just in Holden's deck choice. I think he was, for a lot of players, he was kind of the poster child, the quintessential Lucci player for the past couple formats. But he's been a Dofi player for the past few bigger tournaments now, and that, Lucci players listening, that might be worth doing some introspecting on if your boy over there has finally switched decks. But yeah, I think just in general, past that, Jonas had a really impressive run. He lost in the top 16, but was undefeated up until that point on Doflamingo, just a one card swap, essentially, from his North American finals list. He played fourth Teach over fourth Perona, but just didn't find the confidence, didn't find the time to test the Josus, which we talked about last week. I think other than that, nothing. At least what I'm referencing here on the Limitless website. Just looking at the top 16, but everything else is kind of to be expected. Past that, there's a single Bonnie, two Ploofy, good amount of BY. Definitely more black yellow than last weekend, but I think that was a predictable outcome. I think a lot of players, sometimes players just don't have time, to do all the nitty gritty testing and like we talked about last week with maybe bad impressions on why BY Luffy kind of fell out of favor, and maybe you just that's what I think, and then you see it perform well and you're like, oh wait, never mind, turns out I could play this deck all along, and then people just kind of back to square one. It hasn't really gotten any new cards in a long time, so if you learned the deck a format or two ago, other than some odds and ends and playing around pudding, playing the Dofi matchup, it more or less hasn't changed. I would say its inception, the only newer card, I guess Raigo is new in the sense that it's a format demand more than like a deck building change, just in the way we have some bigger stuff and can cost Blackbeard and things like that for the deck to deal with. But other than the Nami card, the 3 cost blocker that came out of the 3 days 2 years, or maybe the other way, I can never remember, starter deck, and Shirahoshi as well, but no real changes there from say the crosses list the week before. Of course, we saw him as well. He had a good top 64 on stream game against Jonas. But yeah, where do you want to start here, Rishan, in terms of just breaking down everything from the LATAM event?
Yeah, man, there's so much to cover, talk about, to be honest. Man, we can recap just kind of the whole event, kind of talk about, like the top 8, how to play it out, and kind of break down some more on this Shanks winning and Anel being featured in the top 4. Obviously, we talked about it a lot last week, and these were both decks that, like you said, we were kind of considering in the fraud tier. But I think I made the discussion saying that Anel probably isn't. And I feel kind of vindicated in my thoughts seeing it get top 4. But man, Shanks winning is just so surprising to me. I don't understand, and it's not like he dodged Dofi. He played a lot of Dofi in his tournament run, which is super interesting because it's one of the harder matchups for Shanks. Obviously, Shanks is known for being a deck. I guess it shouldn't be surprising that it won because it's known for being a deck that just doesn't really have losing matchups, but nothing but 50-50s, right? Tough matchups, but can win everything. So I guess it makes sense that the right player, the right time with the right draws can win the event, and that's kind of card games, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think just, we'll talk about Nestor and Shanks here in a second, but I think some kind of useful rules of thumb when it comes to analyzing results is that often, the best deck doesn't necessarily win every tournament. The
Right.
best, in fact, good decks don't even necessarily win the tournament. Bad decks and bad lists, just in the way our games work, with variance and matchup roulette, etc. Can spike tournaments all the time, and that's why it's useful. Take Red Green Law winning the regionals in EU, sometime in the '07 format, I believe. Was that a case of Red Green Law being secretly playable? Not really. That it's always, and I think one thing, in just the way that this game works is that like the B tier, probably in the C tier are often a lot more playable than you would think.
Yeah.
And so I don't think it should ever come as a surprise. We saw there was a Robin, now that I'm thinking about it, not in the top 16, but maybe the top 32.
Yeah.
Um, and so, like, Robin is a very competent and capable deck for anyone who's play tested it or play tested against it. Um, Bello Betty, for example, is a deck that I think everyone understands can beat everything, with good enough draws, but it's just not, it doesn't do so consistently. but you could just have a crazy day on Bello Betty, and I don't really, it wouldn't be, the universe changing its law. Thing if Bello Betty had spikes a huge tournament like this.
Mm-hmm.
But what Rayshawn said already is kind of the biggest thing I wanted to highlight out of Shanks's performance, out of Nestor's win. And like the biggest talking point I think about Shanks, or at least the biggest reason why you wouldn't necessarily bring it to an event, is the Dofi matchup. And that's, I think, conditioned on, like we've said, it's close to 50-50. It's even-ish. But for the most part, it's definitely, I'm trying to remember. I think like in one of the box events, like online regional for '09, I think Cody beat like 5 or 6 Shanks on his Dofi that event. And then in testing, it's pretty rare that I lose on Dofi or in the slash even feel like I'm ever in the danger of losing. Shanks has to have some really good draws against some weaker draws in play. And I would like to really, really observe. I don't know how much more he was seen on stream. I caught a little bit of the finals just to see if there's any noticeable difference in the way that Nestor plays in that matchup, because he did not dodge Dofi. Like the red green law we were talking about, it just dodged Lucci that entire event and had a pretty good day against decks like Bonnie. And so this was not a case of Shanks like getting fed the right matchups. Looking at his results right now, he played Dofi 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. He played it 8 times.
That's crazy.
He went and he 2-0'd it, and he played it twice in the top cut, and he 2-0'd it one of those times. That's an incredible consistency. Yeah. I think, like, again, like maybe I would think the more likely scenario here is that he has a line or two different in the way he plays the matchup compared to how we play, how the general consensus of how the matchup is supposed to go. And like I said, I would need to try to find more games and see if I can pin those decisions down. But roughly in what I watched of the finals, I felt like seemed like he was very inclined to counter out earlier than I would have, earlier than I would have expected him to. That purely could have just been like trying to play around pudding, not to just get such a huge hand and get punished for it. I'm really not sure, but I do think it is worth noting here, as we've said, that he crushed Dofi this tournament, and it's like that's kind of the story of the format. If your deck beats Dofi well, you're probably going to do well in any '09 format that you're participating in, certainly a larger one like this.
Yeah, and this seems to be a trend that's kind of carrying over to OP10. I see a lot of, I think people are like just tired of playing as Dofi, right? And so what I'm seeing in Japan is a lot of people trying to play decks that's beating to beat Dofi. And that's kind of resulted into, and I'll pull it up here so you guys can see this graph on the stream. It's kind of resulted into Shanks being like one of the most played decks over in the East right now. It's like the quarter of the graph here is Shanks being the most played, followed by Teach, and then Usopp, and then Dofi's like 4th. So yeah, it's very interesting. I think with the support Shanks gets in OP10 makes that matchup even a little bit more better. I do think a lot of things had to go Nestor's way here in the finals, right? I think there is a couple turns where I feel like the Dofi player in the last game could have pushed through and excelled his game plan, and maybe it was a decision or two behind from just actually making that game unwinnable. But that's that's card games, right? When you play you're out, and sometimes you just have to bank on your opponent making those mistakes, right? I think that in like the last 2 turns, Joao played like a Jinbei that really didn't accomplish anything, where in turn he could have swung 9-9, put his opponent down to 0, and then played to the perfume out. Because if he had perfume and played to that out, I think that game was over. But Joao chose to bottom deck his 1 perfume in a stack, and just kind of made that game winnable for Shanks himself, in what I think was kind of otherwise an unwinnable position.
It is to talk about his list for a second. Last week we talked about the highest performing Shanks list at the NA finals was on 4 Uda. And the list we see here is more traditional in that it's not playing any Uda. But otherwise, it's fairly standard. I know that 7-cost Whitebeard it's common, but it's not an evergreen inclusion. And it's a good card. It's a great card in the Dofi matchup for sure. Just being able to curve into removal and then always having it on board for any kind of reduction and things like that. But past that, it's super standard. 4 Rayleigh, 3 10 cost Shanks. No, it doesn't play. It plays 0 of the other 10 cost Shanks, which is an occasional inclusion. Sometimes you play 4-1, sometimes you play 3-1.
Yeah.
But I mean, nothing really worth noting after that. Sanji 2Ks, couple
Yes.
Lucky Roo, 4 Yasop, 4 Beckman,
Super
4
traditional.
Red Hawk.
And I think this is how I agree with the new gates. Like you said, it's very pivotal, pivotal in the Dofi matchup. More so than Beckman. Like if I'm going first, I don't want to see Beckman on 7. I gotta see Newgate. Just because being able to constantly answer a 5K is just phenomenal for this matchup. So if you can go Newgate into Rayleigh, it's just kind of unwinnable, for the Dofi player. Without playing the Uta searches, a lot of this is you're just kind of luck of the drawing, most of your top end. But Uta doesn't solve that anyways. So I agree with cutting the Uta because the only thing you're searching for really truly is your 2Ks and 10 cost Shanks. So
Yeah, it must be a very strong mulligan for not having any search for such important cards. He must have very, very, very specific things he's looking for in his mulligan. Like it may be like hard mulligan, like no really, no game
yeah,
kind of thing. That's how Noel would refer to certain mulligans when I was learning Bonnie with him. It's just like no Hawkins, it's just an automatic mulligan. So I mean, I would think he has to have some kind of higher level knowledge in terms of understanding how to navigate that. So it isn't just I hope I draw the right card at the right time.
yeah.
And Shanks is such a resilient deck in how it works, excluding the Dofi matchup, which just as we've talked about, part of why it's so good is its just ability to put on pressure, good different kinds of pressure at basically all stages of the game. But in a lot of matchups, it feels like against the Eno matchup, which he beat I guess a different Eno. No, that's the top 4 Eno. Yeah. He beat that, and I guess let's talk about this matchup, and I think that will be a good transition to talking about Eno, because I know at least against I don't have a good sense of what the community opinion is, but in our local scene, I feel like I very consistently hear people talking about Enel being good against Shanks or just good against Red in general. And like on a personal level, I've just never struggled. I've never really seen why people seem to think that is. I kind of play. I haven't touched it in a minute, but kind of one of my go-to like bad decks that I'll bring to a local every now and then is Whitebeard, and I played a little Whitebeard at the I was playing Whitebeard at the end of '08, and I called it just like greed beard. I just played it was like 4 Whitebeard, 4 Rayleigh, 4 Dragon. I forget what else I played. And I remember I went like X1 at one of the tournaments I played it at, and I remember playing against an Enel, and I just beat it really, really badly, basically just curving. And in my head, it's there. I just don't really know what Enel does when you do that. It feels like it's a late game versus late game matchup, and I feel like Red's late game just stacks up better to Enel's yellow. And I've got the reduction, I've got the life. I don't know. I'll kill you. I'll get like 4 8+s or better on board, and then I'll push through. What do you think? People disagree with that?
No, I definitely disagree. Because I've played both sides. And I've always struggled as Whitebeard into NL, and then playing as NL, I've never lost to Red. Period. I think your big bodies are good. I have Rygo to deal with big bodies. I'm able to stabilize with my lead effect a little bit more. Like I can answer all your big bodies on curve while developing bodies. For example, you play Dragon, I have Katakuri to answer your 8 drops. I have Rygos for 10 drops and stuff like that. I think Shanks could be a little bit harder for NL, and it probably is, just because if they see multiple 10 drops and you actually don't have the Rygo or an answer to 10 drop on curve, then like you said, your aces can't ever swing up into the 10 cost Shanks because of the reduction from Shanks, so it could be a little bit harder there. But I think if NL draws the answer, it can be very hard for Shanks in general, and in red in general, like Enel just is what gatekeeps Zoro from being a relevant deck. Anytime Zoro has tried to be relevant, um, and Enel is somewhat in the meta, he just can't, because you can't power through the healing and then the Yamatos and etc. like that. And I think similarly to Whitebeard, where and maybe this is different now with new cards, new red cards. Maybe if they're choosing to run 10 cost shanks or something like that. But just developing 10, like two 10 drop aces in a Yamato and being able to survive for a turn or two makes that matchup seem pretty free, in my opinion. Like I can just swing 20, like 10, 29 and probably get there against Whitebeard. So it's interesting. I don't think it's super Enel favored. Like I think he can lose them more times than you'd expect, but I don't think it's particularly red favored.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely wouldn't push past like 55-45
Yeah.
probably. Like, I definitely don't think it's 60-40 or 70-30. But I think to just like talk about as it very much relates to what you're saying about the Zoro and how this matchup works. I think just in general, like why Enel is a strong deck, even if it's A tier or B tier rather than S tiers, that the way that it works and it's equally kind of the same reasons why it's good against Zoro, I think is also why it's good against Dofi, is that it has its mid game is designed to prey on other mid games. You've got Gatatsu and Nami to get value off of the other 4 and 5 drops. And so for like a deck like Dofir, a deck like Zoro, that's even more so on the littler side, your early game your mid game handles their mid game / early game, and then you just have these unfair boss cards that you stream like every turn after 9 in your motto and aces, which are obviously healing more too. So Shanks, and this was like a big like level up. I remember when I was learning Bonnie in 07, I initially was really struggling in the Enel matchup, and I was being talking to the Bonnie expert, and he was almost just like almost making fun of me. It's like, what are you talking about? Like I just he just really couldn't understand how I could struggle in that matchup. To him, it was free, and part of the things that I fixed and that I was doing wrong is like you don't really want to play your 5 costs in that matchup because they just get puffed. You might as well just hold them for counter and things like that. And so I think Shanks doesn't really have those kind of early to mid game cards where they're just you're losing value and just playing them and letting Nami and Gatatsu pick them off. Like Yasop and Lucky Rua do things even if they die right away. And so even if you choose not to play them, even if you do, they'll hopefully get some kind of value. But then yeah, we're just in this staring contest in the late game. We're like I don't think we're disagreeing with each other. I think it does seem to hinge on Rygo. Because in my head I'm just like if my 10 cost Shanks is stick, like your mottos go down to 8 and then to 7, and then like what does 7 do to Shanks, leader power 2k, so on and so forth. I feel like if I get into a position where like maybe you miss removal and I get to stick a dragon and then play Shanks, and then you have to rag with the Shanks and I keep that other guy on board, like I think I just run away with those games. So I feel like it's like just a branching path on whether or not you have Rago immediately or not. And
Maybe, but I think it's just Enel doesn't care about tall though. That's the thing, is Enel doesn't care about tall swings. He cares about wide swings, and I feel like red doesn't go wide enough, fast enough
yeah,
for it to
but I
scare.
mean,
To
at a
scare.
certain point, like Katakuri, it stops at 8, right? It's 8 or
Yeah,
less. Okay, so I guess you don't have any 9s, so that's definitely good. So walking that back a little, yeah, Katakuri being able to hit all of your bombs other than Shanks and I guess Roger. Um, I don't know. You might have to just play it a time or two. Like I don't feel moved. Like I feel like what I've said is fairly accurate still. But you never know with life triggers and things like that, and that's something that Shanks is definitely, I think, having to be the aggressor at a certain point. And if you just watch your big stuff get removed like 3 turns in a row, then you definitely lose. Um, but yeah, I'd be curious to see how the top 4 game between them.
yeah, I would like to watch that match, because I
Um,
don't know how Enel approaches it. I don't know if they starve. I don't think you can afford to starve. You know, So I'm actually very curious on the general thought process from the NL side on how you approach this matchup.
Yeah, and I guess to talk about the NL list for a second too, the only um it kind of like I was just saying, it's maxed out on those 5 costs, so that's probably something, as well as the 4 cost Kuzan too. So it's probably very consistent in the early to mid game, like I was talking about in terms of what it wants to do. And then just 4 4 4 on Katakuri, Yamato, and Ace. Amaru has come back into the metagame a little bit, at least for it. I'm not sure if the Katakuris, I think there was also a Katakuri in top 32. I don't know if it started playing it again, but just a nice kind of checkmate late game card for yellow.
Yeah, it's mainly here for Teach. It's like and there's a lot of 4-drop blockers in the meta right now, right? You got Lucky Roo, Rebecca, Shirahoshi in the meta and mirror, stuff like that. But this matchup, this card's very good in a Teach. They play if they play their burgers early. Um, uh, you can turn it sideways.
Yep.
You know.
That's what I've read about how the Blackbeard matchup goes. That it's kind of conditioned on if you can answer the Jesuses
Yeah.
early or not. Because yeah, kind of similar thought there. But you win your late game stacks up better. They've only got the 410 beards versus all the stuff you want to play. I think we were arguing about this several weeks ago, and I was a little more adamant about Blackbeard being able to win, but I've thought about that a little more, and I remember the guy was playing like Jax and Kaido in my list, and Kaido's pretty busted in that matchup.
Yeah.
So I definitely agree. It should be Enel's matchup for the most part.
And I think it just won like in the finals in the East in a tournament or something like that against Blackbeard. And then those lists are super interesting in the East right now. They're playing like the new X-Straight card in OP10 where you could tap it and it'll tap your opponent's 4-drops to help with the Burgess issue. They're also playing the 6-drop Lucy card, which is like essentially allows you to draw a card and then rest a 4-drop as well. So they're tagging super hard for that Teach matchup. And I think Teach players are starting to adapt to it basically. Now that they're seeing it, and they just know that they can't play their burgers on 4. They have to save their burgesses for play 2 on 8, but don't play 1 on 4, and that's kind of swaying the matchup back in Teach's favor. Before a while there, everybody's perspective kind of on the matchup changed, and I think it's just because of those cards and triggers being able to play cards and help an L go faster, wider, a little bit faster. Definitely kind of helps swing that matchup in his favor.
You have 4 Kingdom Come, 2 Darashi. Some pretty good just filler plays there for sure.
Dareshi in this deck is insane. Just being able to search for
it's a really good card. I think it's one that just depending on the way they make and print new yellow cards, that I would be willing to wager it will only kind of get better in play. But yeah, just we like peel off, just draw 2. This is search 2 basically. Then there just aren't very many analogous any kind of effects that are that strong. So, and the caveat is just the card requirement just has to be printed, so it's a very very easy problem to solve, at least in terms of the deck building concern. I think so. We've done Enol, we've done Shanks. Let's get back to Dofi then. And so I think the first thing I wanted to mention on Dofi, which I think just goes to show how just freaking strong of a deck it ends up being. Last week when we were kind of pontificating on why exactly it does happen to be so strong, and we talked about, or at least in my own words, I talk about it being like Bob Ross, a happy little accident. It's this kind of early game aggro deck that accidentally gets blue removal. But then we just completely forgot to talk about Pudding.
Yeah.
And Pudding is really kind of antithetical to just the way aggro decks usually work. Or at least Pudding is an anti-control card, and it works in this aggro deck. That's what I'm trying to say. And so, naturally just basic deck archetype stuff. Aggro beats control beats mid-range beats aggro, roughly something like that. Ideally, mid-range wants to beat both somehow. But anyways, and so how control beats aggro is that it gets a really, really big hand. in a big enough hand that it's like expensive cards are eventually enough to just make the aggro player run out of gas. And I think a really strong example of this, at least between us, perhaps not everyone listening, is like from Lurkana, thinking about playing red purple versus like aggro decks, and you just aggro, you run out of cards, and all I have to do is make it to 7, and essentially gravity blade you, but times a million, something like that. And so I get like a 5-for-1 eventually if I can just survive that early aggro. And so that's what Dofi is doing. Dofi, as an aggro deck, how you're punished, quote unquote, for being aggressive in this game is life cards. By losing early, I get card advantage.
Right.
And you don't get to do that against Dofi because of pudding. And there's so many decks where just the fact that you have to play around pudding, it just like it warps all of your plays for like the entire game. Maybe you just choose not to play around it and hope for the best, but like as a Bonnie player, pudding kind of ruins my day. And so I think that before we talk about the balance of the card and sort of the developments between the lists and things like that and what happened, say between weekends and how people chose to play Doflamingo. But I think that's another very kind of important factor to recognize here. It's just like it's an anti-control card that our big, our big bad aggro tech also gets to play. And I think part of it too is that it so naturally just fits into the curve of the deck. It's a 4. Every card in Doflamingo is also a 4. We'll get to this, I think, in just a minute, but I think if this card were a 5, maybe, certainly higher than that, the higher it gets, the worse it gets. But like, I think that's part of the problem, is that it just also tangentially fits so perfectly into the curve that you can, it's so easy for you to play on a turn where you might be also like leader power Jimbying or something like that. So I think it's another just a big factor in why Dofi is just undisputedly the best deck right now, and potentially going into the next format as well.
Yeah, it's super it's super
Yeah.
deflating. Like if you watch the Jonas versus Jellybeans match in Swiss, it forces your hand and your decision making. And Jonas put Jeremy in a very interesting position where you feel like he's gonna putting you regardless if you so he was swinging and he was trying to hit Jeremy to 0, right? And Jeremy's on BY and has a blocker sub up, so it's his choice is to take it and go to 0 and take the pudding, like, or block and probably get puddinged anyways. And then as the BY player, you have to take, because when the pudding comes, all you need to do is draw babies. Whereas if you don't take, you have to draw an Awakener and the babies. Very unlikely. And so it's just game breaking in that sense, right? Where it happened. He took the hit, went down to 0, got pudding, and didn't see any pieces after that. So the card mechanically is just destroys so many decks. Whitebeard can't exist as long as pudding is in the deck or is in the meta. I mean, Whitebeard always struggled against Dofi regardless, but even with pudding, even more so now, right? Like his matchup is just not even a thing. The only way for Dofi to beat Enel is like a fat pudding and pray. So like the card definitely just shapes so much.
Yeah, it's like it's difficult because I think cards like pudding certainly do have their place. And maybe it just shouldn't be in blue or something like that.
Yeah.
But like, what sort of troubles me as we wonder about its balance or banworthiness here is that it's not just that it's a difficult card to play around, or that it's you stop certain decks from functioning, but it's almost like just its existence is almost enough to win you matchups.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of like we're saying, you just have to play around it. But like just thinking about, I learned so much watching Jonas and Cross's top 64 game, and it felt like all Jonas did was just play for value and wait till he had pudding. but that just game plan is so strong that it will work if you see it for the most part. Like the BY player, just whatever deck going down to 5 cards, has to get something pretty strong for the most part. And so I think BY can just like, if you get puttinged into one Moria or two, you end up winning still. But anything past that is just like nothing you can do. So it's like it's played a real role in not just affecting matchups, as like a tech you need to play, but it's like it's a determining factor. And so I think that's something um, as sometimes people miss in terms of analyzing matchups. Sometimes we're not just talking about good matchups or favorable matchups. Sometimes we were talking about deterministic ones. For example, I think like Enel versus Nami in '07. There's virtually no possible plays. I think you could even give like 2 more Dawn a turn, and there's still no way they could ever beat Nami.
Yeah.
And so that's not unfavored. That's an auto loss, in those kind of terms. And yeah, like I know I've disagreed with you historically in whether or not it's a bannable card. Um, but I'm not sure where I am at the moment. It's certainly an unfun card. And I think that's another factor too that people can often under-evaluate when they're considering, the healthiness of a format, the healthiness of a deck. And so what really matters in a lot of ways outside of just like the raw statistics is like the feeling. And obviously you can't, necessarily quantify a feeling in a number or a statistic or something like that. But it's something like as a designer in our playtest, we try to play very much attention to. And I use Nami as my example here because I think Nami, regardless of how good it is in the metagame, it's always just terrible to play against. It's boring, it's slow. Unless you're playing, X, Y, or Z, like we were just talking about with Eno, it just almost doesn't matter what you do.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes people overlook that the sort of the feels badness or the funness, the highs and lows of getting Moria Becca Houndblazed versus just what Moria does in a vacuum or something like that. But yeah, we've talked about putting before, and I think it's a card that sometimes I much prefer physical games. I do think we as card game players have a tendency because of digital games to be a little too hasty, to call for bans and things like that. But on the flip side, you can try different things, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't work with digital card games. And this feels like a card that, like I was talking about earlier, maybe it should just be more expensive. I know when we talked about it in the past, I think it should have a size check. Like it just always shuffles your hand. And maybe if it were like always 6, always 7, like it's still basically doing the same thing. Its role, its function doesn't change at all. But maybe that would make it a little bit different because you obviously playing around Isho or Blocker Law, that was relevant, and those both had cost checks.
Yeah.
So I'm a little confused as to why this one doesn't. But like off the cuff, digital One Piece, we could just do these small kind of tweaks and see what happens. But that's definitely my belief here. You could also probably make it like a 0, a 4-cost 0 as well. Like it's not maybe it is overstated. Like even a 4-cost 4,000, kind of to the point of it just fitting into Dofi. It's easy. You slap one down on it all the time and just get a 5, no
Yeah.
problem. And so it should probably also be a 0. But
And,
yeah,
and their five
running
and their
down
five
through your thoughts.
and their 5 card hand. You're swinging 5 with their 5 card hand the next turn. It's like, well,
Yeah.
shit, I guess.
Mm. But yeah, what do you think past that, Ray Sean? Should we just ban it outright? Like, where's your head at?
Hey, I've been very vocal on Twitter about how I feel about this card, and every time I do, the Twitter peeps get me. I'm scared to say anything. I think this card is hittable, personally. Just off the pure basis that it kills decks. Uta can't exist with this deck with this card. Whitebeard can't exist with this card. Bonnie struggles because of this card. Et cetera, et cetera. BY. I mean, I know people don't feel any sympathy for BY, rightfully so, but like it's a card that shapes matchups, and not just one, but 4 or 5 of them. I think it's maybe a limit. Maybe a limit is more worthy than a ban, right? Make it a little bit harder for them to see this card, 1 of, 2 of, etc. But I don't like it. I hate the card.
Yeah, I feel like the pushback when you've like called for those things before was, more just like blue needs it, and that's not necessarily the case anymore. But I think alongside our conversation last week, talking about like what would we want to hit out of law, I think you may disagree, but for me, obviously pudding plays a great role in Doflamingo as we've talked about. But I think those are two separate conversations. I don't think necessarily that, and it could just be enough on its own. But I think talking about the merits of pudding being bannable is a separate conversation than talking about like what cards should we hit in Dofi. As I just said, maybe it's the happy medium, and we just do that rather than hitting something in Dofi. But like I think Dofi is well. I take that back.
I don't know.
Like,
I think I agree. I think I agree with where you're going. If I had to pick between law or pudding for 2 different merits, I'm still choosing law first. Myself.
yeah, but I mean, even just talking about it here, let's just run with it and pretend that we're talking about the world's format with pudding as the only card that's been hit. And that's certainly a different meta game. Like, as we kind of just talked about, I think the BY matchup flips into being deterministic, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's like BY really, I mean, I guess also going back to maybe something we said last week, I'm slowing down a little bit because you could just play 4 Graph Blade and maybe that's okay. Like, you could maybe adjust in such a way, maybe just heavy Kaidos. I'm not sure, just kind of spitballing here. Maybe there would be ways for Dofi to adapt and still be fine against BY. So I'm walking it back a little, but it certainly changes a lot of things
Yeah.
for sure. But I don't think anyone would disagree that Dofi is still probably in the same tier, even without pudding. I think like it's always such a good problem for decks when they just, oh, look at all this space I have now. Like having 3 to 4 new spots in your list, like if we were talking about lists that are already playing Graph Blade, that's you go to 4 and play another 2K. You're like, maybe you would start playing the Law 2K as some kind of card, hand disruption kind of effects. That was a card I'm just a net decker when it comes to Dofi, and so in the past when I've net decked and had a list with that, I would always like look for that in my matchups and things like that. And it was always good to juggle if you could bounce it multiple times.
Yeah.
So the matchup gets worse certainly, but I'm thinking that Dofi probably ends up being okay.
Yeah. I was testing against Dofi on Tuesday, and they were playing the blocker or the bounce law, and it hit like 2 cards out of my hand. I think like I was fine with it. It made playing around pudding easier for me. So I actually don't know if it helped them or anything because it just kept me at 5 cards in hand. Like so it's an interesting conversation to see how they would change the list if pudding wasn't allowed in the deck anymore.
Yeah, so then to focus a little bit here to sort of wrap up our Dofi discussion, just talking a little bit about the lists we saw perform very well at the event, both of Joao and Holden's lists were very similar for the most part. Just standard Jozu list, 2 Graph Blade, 1 Femur for Joao, and then Holden on 1 and 1 of each. And then, like we already talked about, Jonas only changed 1 card, and so his list is a little more like if I had to pin down like the main card that's the difference, it's more focused on Moria. Like it's just looking to play a value game maxed out of the 4-cost recursion Gecko Moria, but then that's just really the only difference. So not a ton, although that's no interesting text, no Rush Usopp or anything like that showing up in these lists. But yeah, I think the main thought, or I guess two, one being, let's talk about the Kaya tech that Holden was playing. I know our friend Karar has played it. I think it might be a Cody card, like a Cody development. Maybe it's Holden. I don't know. But I associate it with that group at the very least. Why do people play Kaya, say over another Warlord 2K, Rayshawn?
Yeah, I think it's just one of those situations where It's a 2K that can help bail you out of a bad stack. We saw it in top four, where Holden played it in the mirror match, and he drew pretty bad, I think, in both of those games. And Kaya was kind of his out to help him dig out of those situations. It gets you 2 cards closer to maybe something you would want to see that can help you in those situations. So I do think it does definitely has an interesting has a place in this list if you want it to. We see Jonas choosing not to play that, but I think it's because he's playing the Gecko Moria. He can fix his stack. He can fix whatever he wants because he's so Gecko heavy. And whereas these other 2 lists aren't, so Kaya can help them, see what they want a little bit easier.
Yeah, I like the Kaya a lot. Back when I was playing the deck more in EBO1, we didn't have great 2Ks yet. So like you played 4 Kaya, and you also played like 3 to 4 of like the animal pirates like Sasaki that has a shuffle draw effect.
Yeah.
But Kaya was always really good. I felt it's always such a strong card. It's fine to play on one, if you don't have the Perona, and like Rayshawn said, I think its main use case is like just digging. Like I need perfume. It wasn't in these 5. Let's keep going. Or sometimes you see like bad stack, and maybe it's not bad enough to fully bottom deck and like gamble on your attack the next turn or something like that, but it can help you just dig through the cards faster. But yeah, it's definitely very interesting. And then like I think the last card then is just, do you play Gravity Blade, and how many do you play? And so a tweet that Holden, I think it was maybe in his results tweet, just some thoughts he had post event, is he said that he felt that anything more than the 1 Gravity Blade felt bricky, I think. And then I think, what's the point of just playing the 1? So I think he was considering just dropping the card entirely. And I tried that. I won a small local, just the one I went to this week. I think I'm staying on Doflamingo for the format. And I took Jonas's list. It basically insights some Jonas and Holden. I really love the value game that Jonas plays, but I wanted to see what No Gravity Blade was like, and so I prefer Perona, like the 4th Perona over the 4th Teach myself. I think I would rather be maxed out on my 1s. And I'll bring this up in a second, but I struggle to understand how to play Teach. I think that's kind of my biggest struggle with the deck right now. But anyways, I cut both Grav Blade and played 4 Perona and 4 Teach, and it felt pretty good. I liked it. But then I was asking some people in like one of the like the better player discards that we're a part of, and just chatting with, and I think he made top 16, I think, at the Nats finals, and his group plays 3 Gravity Blade, and he talked about it, and like a we stand by it kind of way. Great against Bonnie, great against Mir, great against BY. So there's just some difference in thought there, but at least where I'm at the current moment, I think I agree with where Holden is at, and just like watching Jonas's games last weekend, watching him specifically play against Black Yellow, it never came up. Bonnie is a deck you might play twice, maybe once.
Yeah.
And it can be winnable independent of the Gravity Blade plays.
Yeah. I'm on 1 myself, and I don't even like the 1, to be honest. This card is good in those matchups, Bonnie BY, and it's not that relevant in the mirror. This is what we call a win more card in the mirror, whereas if you're ahead on board, you're ahead in the game state, you're ahead on tempo, and then you play Gravity Blade, it wins you you were already winning. This just kind of seals it for you. But if you play this card from behind, it's doing nothing for you. You're effectively not developing a relevant body that turn, and it's even if you are, say you have a teach on board, it's just going to immediately get answered, and you're going to just get out tempoed right back again by another, Jinbei, Law, etc. So this is a card I personally am playing 1 of, but I agree with 0 personally. And the one interesting list that's different between Jonas's and the other 2 is he's playing 2 Perfume. So you could have this argument of saying, I will go down on a Gravity Blade and play 2 Perfume because it's just a card I have to see in some matchups. If you want to beat Lucci, you have to see Perfume running 2, makes it a little bit easier for you.
Yeah, I like Perfume is a card that I feel like I could play 3.
Yeah.
I feel like you could push me to play the 3rd because at 2, basically, like my finals round or what have you at the local was a Lucci where I won pretty easily. He made some mistakes and I had a fine draw, but I was basically like just late game. He's at 0. Where's Perfume? Where's Perfume? Where's Perfume? He might stabilize, and I didn't see it. Luckily, it got there. But yeah, it's a card I don't think you could budge me on moving from 2, and I would maybe be happy to play 3.
Yeah.
Um, and at the moment, I basically agree with Holden. And I even something the 3 grapple group 7. Another of its merits, of course, is the trigger. Just having another trigger target, but I feel like I can hopefully navigate the matchups well enough without it. But for my kind of teach quandary, I had this come up in one of the mirrors I played on Tuesday, and this is something I think I'm gonna like get some Jonas coaching because I feel pretty good about my play on Dofi, but it's just like the mulligan is really hard for me because Dofi, another of its just merits is that it needs nothing to basically function. It needs a 1 drop to start and then a 4 drop at some point, which it just has so many of. So I feel like I need to learn the more targeted looks, and I just don't know that. But when it comes to teach, I had a game. What ended up happening was I opened with Perona. I think I opened with like Perona on 1, and then teach Jinbei for 3. But on my opening Corona, it wasn't very good. But I just still wanted to. It was still worth keeping for the Jinbei play on my 3. But just what ended up happening is because of that, I just felt like I was running out of cards because there was nothing useful for me to draw, and so all the only plays I had were just keep losing cards from my hand to use the teach effect, and it just didn't feel like I was getting like it just didn't feel like the value I was getting out of the Rested Dawn was like worth stagnating my deck like that, if that makes sense. And I wonder if there's some times where you just see that and say, I just gotta wait on the teach. I need to see more cards or something like that. But I've expressed, and I remember us testing the mirror at just the start of the format, and I wasn't playing a list with teach. I was copying one of Chalice's lists, I think, and he just didn't play Teach for whatever reason. And I had similar thoughts there. I felt like it was just, it's great and it's nutty. It can lead to some kind of nutty combo plays. But I feel like at the cost of cards sometimes. So I feel like I might go back to 3 myself, and I'm not sure what I want to do with that spot, but I might find a way to try to play Jonas's list and like with like 1 to 2 Jozu or something like that. But does that concern, that problem make sense? I just don't really know what to do sometimes with Teach, where it's like I want to be drawing cards, but I don't know if that want is like worth not just keep using the combo.
Yeah, I think when it comes to teach, the important part is just like remembering that like the end goal of Dofi is we want to keep your board standing as much as possible at the end of the turn, so that whether that's with bounce law or whatever. So you want to when you're playing teach super aggressive, you have to find opportunities, whether that's like not swinging a 5k body for a turn or something like that, to force him to hit life, so that way you can get the cards back in hand, so that way you're not feeling deprived of cards in those scenarios. And then yeah, once you see law, teach isn't even a cost at that point anymore, right? Like you just send Goku, search whatever, play law, bounce back to hand, teach effect, and then you start recurring your value right now. But I think with teach, the skill comes with using teach is just finding those small opportunities to force your opponents to give you your cards, give you more cards, and use teach more effectively. And I think you can also see that a little bit more in heavy gecko lists too, right? There's opportunities where you're just okay with them KOing your body, because you're just gonna play Gecko, recur that body back on your next turn, play Teach, play it again. So like a very good turn 3 play is like, or turn 2 play is like on 3 Dawn, Teach, Jinbei, whatever. They swing into your Jinbei, and then your next turn Law, or I mean Moria, grab back your Jinbei, Teach effect, Jinbei, bam bam, and now you have 4 bodies, 3 of them standing. And sure, you're low in hand, but you have 5 lives, and you're gonna draw those cards eventually. But you have 3 standing bodies after that too. So It's just finding those tempo plays with Teach that make him really strong, I think. And personally, I wouldn't move off 4. I think Impact kind of taught me that, like showed me the importance of Teach because I wasn't heavy on Teach. I was playing like 2 before I did a coaching session with Impact. And then I immediately went back to 4 once I saw the value of the card and like how to use it efficiently.
Yeah, it's like I think I just made a mistake. Like I think I just shouldn't have played the Teach, and it's not necessarily a
Yeah,
concern about the card because I think just like the way that game ended up going, and I think part of where my concern is at is like I just I think a good opponent would have beaten me pretty badly just in the way like my hand was and my stack was. I ran out of I lost I like just didn't have any cards in hand because I kept going to the top deck. So then I wouldn't have been able to fight for my board. But he just gave me too many cards when I would press his board, so it didn't end up mattering. But I was like worried. Basically, that whole local, I was just like, if all my opponents were good, I think I would have gone 0-3, but they weren't.
I think you never early Teach unless it's like Weevil. If it's
I think that's what I had. I'm pretty sure my 3, Prono 1, 3 was with the unplayable sack passes was with Jinbei Weevil. Like
yeah,
I think
that's
that
what I'm
was
saying.
my
I
3.
don't think you Jinbei Weevil because then that's too many cards in hand are gone early. But I think you just Weevil and then we save the Jinbei for maybe Jinbei Boa next turn or something
No,
like
I think
that.
you're right. That makes sense. That
Yeah.
makes sense. For sure. All right. So moving on, then last topic I think for today's episode is we're kind of getting started for OP10. It's finally available on the sim. Not to fault our benevolent solo developer on the sim. He's got a life. He's got a family. He does this in his spare time. So certainly uh, no ill will towards him whatsoever. But it's just a little later than we would usually get these things. I think he had a nice holiday break, paternity leave, and things like that.
Yeah.
But it's finally here, and so we as Westerners are able to really start picking up playtesting, picking up and playing these new cards. So I think briefly today we want to just kind of talk about the new leaders that are coming out, what they do, what they're playing with, and then we have it's quite a big event this weekend. It's the Asia final, so I think that's it's like Thailand and Malaysia and those countries. I want to say I don't think it's Japan, like Singapore, of course.
Yeah. I think Japan
Um,
has their own thing.
right.
So
But yeah, and then I'm just trying to qualify it because I think the Philippines then must just have their own because the Ralph, I think his name is, but just the Bonnie player. I know he won the Filipino one with Bonnie. He won that finals a few weeks ago in OP10. But for whatever reason, I don't have too much to talk about there. But we just have a big event with some pretty big name players about to fire off just this evening. I think in the middle of the night for Americans, roughly.
mhm.
But where do you want to start? I know you've been playing. I haven't played the sim yet. I know Rayshawn has. Walk us through what's going on.
Man,
At least get started in OP10.
I think as far as like fun leaders, OP10 hits the mark, man. We got a lot of multicolor leaders that are very interesting, and then we got one monocolor leader. But man, all these leaders so far, I got smoked by a smoker last night in testing. So let's read this card's lead effect because it's pretty insane what this lead effect is. So during the opponent's turn, all your navy or punk hazard type cards get 1,000 power, so they're harder to KO. And then you could activate main once per turn. If you have a character with 7,000 power or more, you can set up to 2 Dawn cards as active. So this gives you access to extremely big plays. Like I had a guy last night play a Beckman on 7, and then he had a smoker on board, the 5-cost smoker, which allows you to restand. I think it's restand a Dawn. So he played that smoker and then lead ability, and he had 6 Dawn active after he played a 7 drop on me, and I was like, this is absurd, this is insane. So very strong lead effect. I think probably the sleeper pick of all the leaders in this. I think it's easy to be like, it's maybe not strong enough to win a tournament, but one wrong card, I could see this leader
Yeah, I was
just being
reading
really
this leader.
busted.
Like, I was trying to go through cards because I knew I didn't know what Sugar and Caesar and Smoker really did.
Yep.
But like as a leader, it feels to me like some kind of like hybrid, obviously working a little differently with opponent's turn rather than your turn and things like that. But it's like half Zoro, half like like revolutionary army almost. Like it's looking for 7Ks in play for your second trigger. But yeah, it seems interesting. The 5 cost smoker is very good. For those who don't know, just playing off what Rishon said, it has it's activate main restanded on, so it's like a little more proactive than the end of turn ones, Carrot and Rogue. But then when you do it, you don't get those other kind of effects, so you don't always have to turn it on. Say if you're playing Bonnie, which I think plays it here and there. But in this deck, you're just, I think, always using it to restand, and then it's a 5 cost 7 with banish
With banish,
too.
yeah.
Yeah. Seems good. I think just like I think the big decks, the big leaders to talk about in the set are the yellow ones. So let's go through the rest of the multicolored ones. Some of the ones that people are I don't think terribly enthused about. The
Yes.
next one being Caesar, which I think I've joked about. It's everyone's favorite character. They're really excited for Caesar. We've got a red blue Dawn 2 when attacking, return a punk hazard with a cost of 2 or more. And KO a 4 or less. So I mean, it's a pretty solid identity for red blue. Return to hand, and then looking for like reduction to KO.
It's just bad RP
Um,
law.
yeah.
That's how I view it.
Um, yeah. Yeah, it's similar. You're returning something little of yours to KO something. But yeah, I think Law is just such a busted card. It was just like you get the value of playing something for removing something,
Yeah.
and that's the way the purple cards shook out. You had cards that the Don minus really didn't matter. But yeah, I don't know what blue ends up what blue you would want to play with this. I haven't really seen any Caesar lists.
Yeah,
It
me
doesn't
either.
it hasn't performed at all, so it's I don't think really on anyone's radar. The red cards in the set mostly being the punk hazard cards. But yeah, I don't really know how you would play that. The next leader probably a little more playable, but at the end of the day, maybe just ending up in the same tier. We have Sugar, red purple Don Quixote. End of turn, if you have a Don Quixote pirate with 6K or more, restand to Dawn. Kind of going with the other like a GP Dofi restanding Dawn. And then end of opponent's turn, once per turn, when you activate an event, you ramp a Dawn. Also don't really know. I don't have a good sense of what you would want to play this with, other than I think it plays out of the set. You play the red Punk Hazard cards and then the new purple Don Quixote cards, but it's not one that really speaks to me at all either.
Just a super defensive leader that gets benefit from playing a lot of counter events. Ramp up, play big bodies pretty early. Kind of can kind of tempo its way into games, but yeah, otherwise I think pretty underwhelming currently.
I think event leaders are always just kind of duds, unfortunately. Ace. I mean, I know Ace has been good to playable at certain times since it's been printed, but at least in its current state, it's even with the newer Whitebeard cards, it's like worse than Whitebeard, worse than starter STO1 or Luffy and things like that. So probably something similar here. I guess on the front though, in terms of the red cards, I think both it's the Chopper and the Sanji are, I think, some of the just in general best cards coming out of the set. Basically, I feel like every red list, regardless of if they're one of these two new leaders, plays these cards. It's an interesting like Vivi buff,
Yeah.
for example. But the Sanji is a 3 cost 3K. That is a 6K on your turn, and then on KO draw a card. It's really strong. And then the Chopper is a 2K. That's just a 4 cost 6K blocker. It's very playable, but also a 2K.
Yeah.
Very 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 playable as a 2K. Just usually a pretty good sign.
Yeah, good cards all around there. I think for red, I've seen Shanks even play some of those cards in some lists. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's probably where I've seen them too.
Yep. Next leader we got here is my favorite of the set. We got green, yellow, Trafalgar Law. So for Dawn times 1, and then activate main once per turn. If the total cost of your characters is 5 or more, you may return one of your characters to the owner's hand. Reveal one card from the top of your life. If that card is a supernova type card with the cost of 5 or less, you may play that card. It's the traditional Law deck, man. Tempo. We're spamming bodies. We're spamming 5-drop bodies pretty fast on board, with the effect that it's kind of a little bit more difficult to set up. Maybe not as hard as like Red Green Law was, but like the 5 cost character limit can make things a little bit confusing, and then also having to set up the life yourself sometimes can be a little bit hard. But we got the support with like the Bej and the blocker Bonnie to help with those situations. We also get the 7-drop Law, which is just a busted card, and you see it in Law list and Kid list because it's just good yellow healing as well. So this is definitely a leader I'm super excited for. What are your thoughts on it?
No, I think both of us are like looking to play it for the format as like might not be the best deck, but we just kind of want to develop something. And as far as we can tell, it's like not like dominating the East, but it's I forget which player it was, but there's a pretty notable player that had like a top 16 performance with it. It seems like a lot of decks too. I think one of the big reasons like not to play it is both Blackbeard and the fact that, as we talked about last week, Blackbeard is just more popular in the East, and so I think that's what's been keeping it down for the most part. But just like reflecting on what's happened for the '09 format in the West, Blackbeard just doesn't really like. It's something you can lose to, something you should know your matchup, but like you might not play it, and it doesn't seem to. It's topping, but it's not performing very well, and topping in very low numbers. Like we talked about last week, it has a very weak click conversion rate. Even if it won, even if it like won all of these finals, it would still not be a great deck.
Yeah.
But it definitely seems like I want to play it. I'm a Bonnie player. I have all the green supernovas are my bread and butter already. It just seems fun and fast. And I like to play bad decks, like if I can. I'm hoping that it was a little disappointing, like for the '09 format, that we didn't have store treasure cups or store regionals. Because I played Carrot at our store regionals. Just it's nice to at a local level, like probably can't perform with this at a regional, but I think I can push this bad deck pretty far locally, and so I think we at the very least have that intention with Law. The Secret Rare Law, the 7 cost, reveal a supernova and add it face down to your life, and then you get Arrested Dawn, and it's a 7 cost 9, so it's like overstated or vanilla statted for the cost, so just very good on that front, as well as just a full comboing for both the Kid leader, both the Law leader. And so I think both as a transition for us to talk about just Kid, I'm curious as to like why, because they're going to be playing with both wanting to play with the new yellow supernovas that are coming out of the set. Like, talk to us about Kid, and then talk to us about why you would play one over the other, and then potentially which one you think is better.
Yeah, so like I definitely think Kid is the better leader. And the reason why I think Kid is the better leader is because it meets in the middle. It meets in the middle of a Nell and like Katakuri, right? Whereas it plays aggressive towards like Katakuri does, but it also has the defensive tendencies of a Nell, right? Being able to establish a big blocker every turn, or every few turns or so, is huge for the deck. So it gets to be super defensive, as well as it has the healing. They're playing Ace, so I think overall, when it comes to the meta, dealing with decks like Dofi, it being a 5-life leader is enough to say it's probably better in the meta on itself, like leadability aside. But then you add the defensiveness of the deck, and I think it's really solid. And it adds to the vanillas, right? You see a lot of lists right now are running like this 5K, this 5 cost Euroj. It's a 5 cost 7K, but it's a relevant body. It's a blocker. It's going to swing for 7 every turn, and then it's going to restand and swing for 5. Same thing with the 6 cost 8K Cavendish. Does the same thing. So as well as having strong effects with like there's a Hawkins that you can force it to be a blocker, force it to block, and then trash one of your opponent's life.
Yeah, has an on KO effect.
Yeah,
so does,
on KO.
A couple of the new supernovas. I just have that just plain synergy with the leader.
Yeah.
On KO effect, Kid's gonna make it block.
Yep. So it's very strong, and then it just gets the benefit of playing the other, like some of the NL package, playing the Gadatsu, playing the Ace and stuff like that. Makes it very strong in the meta. And Law, man, just has a lot of stability. So while we're seeing not an extreme high turn rate, 1 or 2 is sneaking into every top 16 right now in the East. So a strong deck in that sense.
Yeah, they both seem really, really good. I'm not gonna play Kid regardless of if it's a good if it's the better of the two or if it's just like ends up being the best deck or something like that. Um, so final new deck then will be Usopp. And I think, fan favorite, we're finally excited to have an Usopp leader. And like in terms of power level, I think the like most obvious comparison for Usopp is, or at least maybe going back to what I talked about in the Smoker Leader, that it's like a hybrid of like a Black Luffy and Boa. But Boa was where I was going with that initial sentence. It's a leader that draws cards with on a trigger, or on a condition within the game when your hand is at 5 or less.
Mm-hmm. It's a tempo Rebecca is what I compare it to. You could play
Yeah.
it. There's so many different builds of this. Like I definitely think this is a leader that's not solved at all in the East. It's seeing a lot of play rate as we saw, as you guys can see here in this graph. Like it's the third most played deck right now in tournaments, which is pretty insane. But there's so many different variations, so many different lists that we're seeing for this leader that I can't quite call it solved yet. And so its effect is all your Dressrosa types get with the cost of 2 or more gain +1 cost, which is really good, helps in your black matchups. And then once per turn, when one of your Dressrosa type characters is removed from the field by your opponent's effects or KO'd, if you have 5 or less in your hand, you get to draw 1 card. So very strong kind of blanket effects, I think. And the draw card is similar to Boa in the sense comparison that you're making, that you get to counter really aggressive. You get to play blockers really early and just let them die. So you get to stay healthy at 4 life for a long time and then not lose cards. It's really good.
So always plussing off it. Yeah, I mean, I think kind of like we've talked about it pudding. I never liked Boa as a deck. Basically because you have to play so conditionally. Like sometimes you can't make quote unquote the best plays because you have to make quote unquote the best play that allows you to draw instead, and that can often have to like counter a little worse than you would like to. And Boa has never been terrible, but I think also never been great either. And so maybe but I do agree that this doesn't seem solved. I think in a vacuum, which is at most, I think almost everyone would agree with, in a vacuum, blue black is still probably the best multi-card pool you can ask for. But yeah, I'm not. It's a lot of possibility. What old cards get played in Usopp? Like if I were looking to buy some cards this weekend, like what Rebecca Dressrosa kind of cards would I maybe be looking to pick up?
Yeah, it's all very, like I said, there's so many different builds. You definitely want to pick up the 1 cost Rebecca Searcher, regardless if you're playing it in your list or not. Lists are constantly evolving, and we know the strengths of playing dual searchers because you have one of the best searchers in the game in Leo. But you definitely want to pick that up. Suru is being played in a lot of lists. The more control heavy versions are playing Suru. They're playing one-legged toy soldiers. A lot of lists aren't playing 4-drop Rebecca, especially the lists that are playing the 1-drop Rebecca Searcher. They're not playing 4-drop Rebecca, which is very interesting, man. I thought for sure the black deck would play the best black blocker card, especially with its typing, but a lot of lists are opting out of it. So I think that's just another scenario where I'm like, man, maybe this just isn't solved.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely I agree that it's not solved, but I guess I'll also say that I'll be surprised if it's like secretly Sakazuki or something, and someone hasn't found like the full combo yet.
Yeah.
I think it's probably maybe better than the numbers indicate, but which I think is a good transition to the just talking about what current decks get out of the set. Is that it ends up being a good deck, but that the big dogs, the heavyweights, end up still just being very, very good. And so just like if you've ever just like looked at the 10 OP10 results, it's mostly still, at least as the East is concerned, like we talked about at the start, Shanks is very popular and has maybe been trending up a little bit, but mostly still the Doflamingo show at the end of the day for the One Piece trading card game, with Blackbeard probably right behind. And like Dofi gets no new cards. Dofi has gotten no new cards since starter decks, and it's just still the same. Is that correct?
Yeah, still the same. Nothing's changed. We saw some interesting text this week. We saw Houndblaze being played in one of the top 6 lists. Uh, but outside of like interesting text like that, no new cards, no new support, which is pretty
Yeah,
absurd.
Blackbeard, in contrast, though, does have a pretty new shiny toy in um, Kuzan. And Kuzan is a 5 cost that, kind of like Burgess, it's not KO'd, but it just can't be removed by any effect. And then activate main, you trash this character, draw a card, and then play a Blackbeard 5 or less other than Kuzan from your trash. I remember myself probably being guilty of this. I remember this card was spoiled. A lot of us were just like, and I think we hadn't quite, reached the conclusion of where we are in the metagame now, where Blackbeard didn't quite shine as brightly as we expected it to. But we saw this card and like Blackbeard's already a complete deck. This card, it gets this card too, and it's, to be clear, it's an incredibly powerful card. But I think what ends up being the truth about it and just the way that it works is that it's a consistency buff basically for Blackbeard. It makes you able to play out of the trash a little bit differently than you were before, which makes your so you're discarding for your leader effect, you're discarding for off your search events and things like that. It just kind of turns those maybe unfortunate occurrences into bodies essentially. So the lists don't change too much other than like cutting corners in order to fit the card. But I think in terms of just like analyzing the power of Blackbeard as a deck is that it's better, but like this card isn't solving any problems for Blackbeard. It's not a new line against Dofi or anything like that that suddenly fixes that matchup. So I don't think like its space or its like power in the metagame, what it beats, what it loses to, changes it all, but it's just a really powerful card. Happy to see, to be sure. And I guess the other card worth mentioning, a handful of other cards that I don't think they get played at all for Blackbeard, but the other big one is an event. It's called Liberation, so I don't know what it'll end up getting called for us, but it's a 6-cost main. If you have 2 or more characters less, that's just bad
Yeah,
wording
it's
to
bad
say 2
wording.
or
It's
less.
bad translating. That's true. But if your opponent has two more characters than you,
KO up to one of your character's cost with an original cost of 6 or less, and with an original cost of 4 or less. So it's interesting in that I think this is maybe the first and only black card that's specific of that base cost, rather than just any cost. But it's a 2-for-1 against Doflamingo, is why it's good. Certainly probably playable in other matchups, but it's probably its biggest case. And so with this and Kuzan, I think should probably expect to see Blackbeard start to see a little more play. But if our format just remains so Doflamingo centric, we'll just have to wait and see, of course. But I think it just ends up being about the same. But I think even like we failed to talk about this. Maybe we'll come back to it next week. But like for the February Treasure Cups, like part of me is going to play Dofi, but another part of me is just like, I should just play Blackbeard for that event. Like, because the way that onlines go for most players, I haven't really fully participated in one yet. But most players are just like, if I lose the first round, I just go drop and do something else. So that just seems like the perfect deck to have that mentality with. I'll sit down, I'll play the first 2 rounds. If I get Dofi'd, no problem. I'll go have a good rest of my weekend. But if I just get fed like the good matchups all day, then then I'm just at my computer, my brain's off. I don't have to do anything. Hope maybe just get like 7 auto wins or 8 auto wins and get a cereal or something like that. It seems like a really good bring if you're like not really looking to play or something like that.
yeah,
But that's where my head is at, and I'll definitely be looking forward to playing with the buffs.
yeah. Blackbeard will not be fun to play against in a OP10 for sure.
Mm, I think that's good. I think we've gone pretty long. I don't think I want to hit anything else or the things we missed on the agenda. Do you have any closing thoughts or anything for us?
No, appreciate everybody for tuning in. We'll definitely be talking about Asia Finals next week, so make sure you guys tune into that this weekend. And then, yeah, looking forward to talking some more One Piece.
Yep, that will be us here at the Untitled One Piece podcast. We are the only podcast about the One Piece trading card game. We'll catch you next week. See you then.
Peace.